Hi everyone, I'm Phil Mason and I'm here with Joe Matisse. We're going to be watching a pre-recorded session now entitled Git and SAS, a match made in SAS Studio. I've had a little look at it beforehand and it's really good stuff. There's a lot of great information there, so it's going to be good. Once the recording completes, Joe will be answering some questions that you can submit in the chat window. So let's get right into it now. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Joe Matisse, and I'm here to talk to you about Git and SAS Studio. Whether this is your first time thinking about using Git, or you're a seasoned Git pro, SAS Studio has something for you. What word would you use to describe the feeling when you see this window? Trepidation, fear, confusion? Or are you comfortable knowing you're only a few commands away from submitting your code to its safe place in the cloud? For many of us, the command line is at best a necessary evil, and often a place that we dread. SAS Studio can help you get away from the command line and make your workflow with Git better. Today, we're going to give a brief overview of how Git works. Then, we'll walk through setting up your Git profile in SAS Studio. Finally, we'll step through some basic Git operations using SAS Studio's interface. First, our overview of Git. Git stores a local copy of your code in a repository. That repository is local to your PC or on your network share where your files are stored. For SAS Studio, we usually have to have the files stored on a network share or other server-accessible location. But the important part is that this local repository is stored where your code lives. Small changes are updated to that repository through a process called a commit, as often as when the file is changed in any meaningful way. Think of this as the save command. You likely also have a server copy of your Git repository. That server copy is updated through a process called push, and then we update our code from the server through a process called pulling. These processes happen less often, usually when we're ready to share our code with others. Good news, we can do all of this and more in SAS Studio. Starting with SAS Studio version 3.8, you can now access most commonly used Git operations without leaving your browser. You can commit changes, push code to the Git repository server of your choice, pull code down from that server, work with branches, and more, all from inside the SAS Studio interface. Even better, if you already use Git and have it installed locally, this is fully compatible with that workflow. Use the parts of this that are helpful, and use your already existing workflow for the parts that you prefer to use that for. Now, let's set up your first Git profile. You'll need some information in order to get started. First off, you need the Git server address. This is likely a web address, something like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, or possibly another solution. You'll also need how you are going to connect to that server, whether you're going to use SSH or HTTPS. Each server will have its own documentation for how to connect. If you are doing something internally, please talk to your IT department in order to find out how they prefer you to connect. Finally, you'll need the necessary user credentials for the particular type of connection you're using, either an SSH key or your username and password for HTTPS. Don't worry if you don't have this information right now. We'll cover how to get that later in the presentation. You have two ways to authenticate to your Git server. This only applies to operations involving that Git server. Anything you do locally is handled through your normal login. HTTPS, for many people, is the easier method. And if you don't mind updating your password whenever that changes, this might be the better option for you. It's as secure as any HTTPS connection. You do have to cache your password locally, but SAS manages that for you and stores it in an encrypted format. In order to use HTTPS, you must be on Studio 3.8 with a hotfix applied. If you don't see this option, you may need to talk to your SAS administrator in order to ask them to activate HTTPS and install a hotfix. SSH does require a little bit more upfront effort, but it won't need to be updated every time you change your password. It authenticates you instead with a key file. The one big caveat is that currently, SAS does not support having a passphrase on that key file, so some IT administrators may prefer you not to use this option. Hopefully, in the near future, SAS will update this option. To set up using the HTTPS method, start by going to the Preferences dialog from the upper right-hand hamburger menu in SAS Studio. Select Get Profile, and then hit the plus icon in the upper right. That will add a new profile. Next, on the Add a Profile screen, select Switch to HTTPS. Here, you will put in your name you want to give the profile, and then enter your login credentials to your Git server. This is probably not your Windows credentials, but it's GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever server you use. In the case that it is an internally hosted solution, it may actually be your Windows credentials. Once you've entered that username, password, and the email address associated with the account, you're all set. Until your credentials change anyway, in which case you'll have to come back in and update them. One note, if you are using GitHub and want to use HTTPS, they are now changing how they use the HTTPS authentication method. For more information, look up token authentication on GitHub for more details. Setting up a profile with SSH is done largely in the same manner. Go to the Preferences menu, then select Get Profiles and Add a Profile. Here, you need your SSH key, which is usually titled ID_RSA for the private key, and ID_RSA.pub for your public key. If you don't have these, no worries. We can make them. Of course, only if you don't mind a tiny bit of command line. Creating a public key, you need to use the command ssh-keygen. This is an optional feature in Windows, usually coming pre-installed, however, with Linux. If you installed Git for Windows prior to doing this setup, you likely have it as well, even in Windows, through that installation. Exactly how you generate the key in terms of options may vary slightly depending on the requirements of your Git host server, so please look up the documentation or talk to your IT administrator to get the specifics. The example here works for GitHub. Do make sure to leave the passphrase empty. There is not currently a way to use a passphrase in SAS Studio. The files this creates must be saved to a location that your SAS Studio server can see, probably not your C drive. Either copy them to that network share or use the Upload Files feature in SAS Studio to copy them to a location that the server can see. Now, let's cover some basic Git operations with the profile we just set up. First, let's talk about cloning. No, we're not talking about Dolly. Cloning with Git refers to the process of creating a new local repository as a copy of an already existing repository on the Git server. It is usually how you will bring your files into your local PC and SAS Studio from your Git server. If you want to go the other way around, take files that you already have in SAS Studio and put them in Git, no worries. We'll have you covered in another slide. To clone our first repository, go to the Git repository section and select Clone a repository. Then, put the URL for your repository in the Remote Repository box. If you don't know this URL, you should be able to get it from your Git server documentation. Most likely there is a clone button on the same page as you can view your repository. And then enter where you want it saved on your local server in the Local Repository box. You may need to browse in SAS Studio to create the folder on your server first. Then select the profile if you have more than one, and hit OK. If you are using a repository that already exists on your computer, then just select Open a local repository and browse to it. When you select the correct folder, it should show you the remote repository, as the example does here. Select your profile and hit OK. You'll notice that it has a slightly different icon. Even if it's not loaded in SAS Studio, SAS recognizes that you have Git set up for that folder and gives it a special icon. Now that we have cloned our repository, it shows up in the Git repository section. See where it says Presentations on the screen? We can view the history of the repo by clicking on the History button. This shows us all commits prior to when we cloned the repo. Notice here how there are quite a few commits already on my repo. Now, let's test opening a file and making a change. We'll open the example.sas file and add a few lines of code. First, open the file just like you normally do in SAS Studio from the Server Files and Folders menu. Then, make a change. I, for example, added a proc mean step here. Then, save, just like normal in SAS. Now, before we commit, let's first see what we changed. Select the Commit tab under Git repository, and then right-click on the file. You should see a few options, one of which is Show Differences. Select that. You will see a window that shows what was added, deleted, or changed since the last time you committed. You can go down line by line and verify that everything is good. When you are satisfied, you're ready to really commit. Once you're ready to commit, you first need to stage the files that you are going to commit. You can right-click on each one and stage them from that menu, or you can select Stage All, which is what I usually do, to move all files that have pending changes down to the Ready to Commit box. Then, don't forget to type in a descriptive commit message. This is what you will view when you see the history for this file later on, so make sure that it makes sense. Finally, select Commit Staged to actually commit the staged files to your local repository. Remember, this doesn't send them anywhere. They're just in that local folder still. We'll get to sending them up to the server shortly. Here, we can view our history again. Select the History button, or go back to the prior tab and hit refresh. You'll see a new entry now, and we can clearly see that our local repo is off of the server version. Notice how the maroon master is on top, and there's a light blue origin master line right below it. That's the server version. We're ahead by one version, so let's fix that so anyone else downloading this gets the new version. To push, we just select Push from the repository screen. The screen will show a pushing spinning circle briefly, and then it will refresh the history so that we can see that the push was, hopefully, successful. Notice how the origin master light blue line is now on the same line as our master maroon. That shows that the server and us agree once more, and anyone else pulling down a copy of this file will get my latest changes. Now, let's take a look on GitHub. If you open up the file in GitHub, you can see that our changes are actually there thanks to our push operation. That means anyone who downloads this file will now have the most up-to-date data. Next, let's make a change so we can simulate what happens when one of our colleagues makes a change on their end. We'll just make a minor change on GitHub, and then we'll put in a nice, useful commit message. Then, This will make its way back to us locally when we perform a pull. Now, in order to perform a pull operation, we do basically the same thing as we did with push. This time, click on pull. You'll see another spinning dialog box saying pulling, and then it will again refresh the history. Notice that our new commit message is now present on the top line, and the commit message we gave it when we pushed is now on the second line, but both server and local are on the same version. In order to see what changed in the last version, we can select the Files tab in that history menu, and then click on the file. It shows you the diff, or the changes, just as when we viewed the changes in the commit section earlier in the presentation. Remember that, unlike with committing, we will not see the changes made on the server in Git unless we have done a pull. If the changes are not correct and you wish to reject them, you must perform a reset. The reset option is available in SAS Studio, and more information on that can be found in the documentation. We do have many other Git operations that can be done inside SAS Studio. In particular, we can work with branches, which are how different colleagues might work on the same code base without affecting each other's code until they're ready to combine them together. We can both create and merge branches inside SAS Studio. We also can reset our changes, as I mentioned a moment ago, in order to undo something that you weren't happy with. Finally, we can also delete a repository, all in SAS Studio, either deleting it locally or deleting it from the server entirely. All of these options and more are discussed in the SAS Studio documentation. Look up the correct documentation for your SAS Studio version. I want to thank these following people for helping contribute to this presentation. And of course, thank you for watching. The presentation wouldn't exist without such a great audience. For more information, please feel free to contact me at matissejoe@gmail.com or view my presentation repository, including this presentation, at github.com/snoopy369/presentations.
Well, Joe, thanks very much for your presentation. It was really good, really very interesting. A lot of comments, 320 people watching at the moment live as well, so good audience. Let's look at some of the questions that have come up. I've picked out a few. Marcelo was asking, how does SAS implement Git?
Sure, thanks, Phil. And thanks everyone for watching. Marcelo, my understanding is that SAS uses the libgit, was it libgit or libgit2? libgit2 C library behind the scenes. You can see the functions are available depending on whether you're using Viya with, I think, at least 3.5, Studio 3.5 or newer, or if you're using the SAS Studio with like 9.4 with not Viya, which will be, I don't remember what version we're on. Anyway, 2.8, I think. There's two different sets of functions. There's the git fn underscore functions, which the older versions of SAS are using, and there are the git underscore functions, which the newer ones are using. One is using libgit2, and I don't recall off the top of my head which, but in both cases they're using sort of off-the-shelf C libraries, is my understanding. If you want a little more about that, you can talk to the developer who is on Communities. I think it's Danny Zimmerman. He's on communities.sas.com, and that's actually how I learned a lot of the stuff that I ended up in this, is asking some questions about how to make things work.
Okay, great, thanks. There was a little follow-up from Marcelo as well about Git tags. Is it possible to use Git tags from SAS Studio?
Git tags? I'm not sure. From Studio, probably the answer is probably not. Particularly with commits, you don't really have a lot of options. If you look at the function, you can see what the function has available to it. It just basically has directory, the branch, your name and email, and a commit message.
Okay, that's good.
So that's all that's in commit.
Now there's another user, Dr. Mighty, I think must be a professor or something. He was asking a question about something he could do with these students. He was asking if there's a tutorial on how to set up Git that he could give to students, particularly for SAS on demand for academics.
Sure, thanks. So my understanding is that it is not currently implemented in SAS on demand for academics. I only have access to the public version, which is the SAS 9.4 version of SAS on demand for academics, since I'm not an academic. And that doesn't seem to have the Git integration built in. That could change. It was added, Git integration was only added pretty recently in SAS 9.4, and it required some changes in the on the server settings. It's possible they just didn't change that, and they will eventually. But it's also possible they don't want to enable that for one reason or another. You may still be able to use the Git functions behind the scenes. I'm not sure. And I'm also not sure if it would work with the Viya version of SAS on demand for academics, which you may be using if you're using it in an academic setting. That's, again, a question I would probably direct on communities.sas.com. You'll probably get a good answer there, either from one of the on demand for academics folks, or maybe from one of the Git developers.
Okay, that's good. Now, I saw on YouTube there are a few comments from people, a few questions about Git on Enterprise Guide, because I think Git on Enterprise Guide has probably been around a bit longer than on SAS Studio, as far as I know. And there were some questions about how it handles embedded code in projects, and can you even just do the sort of things you were talking about in Enterprise Guide, or is it different in some way? I don't know whether you can comment on that. Sure.
Yeah, so newer versions of Enterprise Guide, definitely EG8, and some of the later versions of 7, maybe 7.1.3, began storing their code internally in Git, internal Git repo. You can ask it to not do it internally, but just use an actual external repo. And so that can actually make it really easy. You have a little more fine-grained control there, because then you still have all the same controls you have pretty much in Studio. I know one of the questions asked if you could store a whole project that way, and you certainly can store a project in Git. I don't tend to. What I tend to like to do when I'm using Enterprise Guide and Studio as well, but obviously I don't. Not as many people probably use Studio to do the projects, or I forget what Studio calls projects, but the task flows, I think. That doesn't tend to work as well in Git, rather than having the individual programs stored, because you're going to have trouble like doing diffs and things like that. You're better off storing every single program in there. And then I keep my EGP outside of Git. I just have that's my local. So like I have a test EGP that has a couple of embedded programs that aren't stored in Git that do things like define my environment for tests specifically. And then I have a prod EGP that does the same thing for prod, and I have a couple of environment programs in it. And then all of the individual programs are stored in Git individually, and then sent up to the server and pushed and pulled and all that. That makes going from test to prod very easy. But I wouldn't probably store the whole project, except maybe more like as a backup.
Okay, that's good. I see on YouTube there was someone who was saying they don't have that particular Git view in their SAS Studio interface. Christian, I think, was asking that. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So the Git integration in Studio is only added, I think, in 3.8, but not even just original 3.8. There actually, you had to have a hotfix enabled, and I think so, like a lot of places don't have that hotfix enabled in order to make it work properly. And so most likely, if check to see which version of Studio you have. If you have Studio 3.8 or newer, or you're on Viya like version 4 or whatever, I think you can ask your administrator. If you are already on that version, you can ask your administrator, and they may be able to turn it on for you. Even if you don't, as long as you're on SAS 9.4, I think TS1M6, I believe, is when the Git functions were enabled. So you still could use the Git functions in a SAS program directly if you're unable to get it to work directly through Studio. But it's definitely a question for your SAS administrator if you don't see it yet. And if you're on an older version of Studio, I would certainly encourage you to ask your administrator to upgrade. Studio upgrades they're adding a lot of functionality pretty consistently, so it's a great idea to upgrade. If they do need the 3.8 hotfix, I think if you search Chris Hemminger has one of the original papers or a blog post sitting at communities.sas.com about this being enabled, and he specifically references the hotfix there, so it's pretty easy to find.
Okay, that's great. You sort of answered another question of mine there too about whether it works on Viya, but you did mention Viya, so obviously it works on Viya, which is good. There was one other thing I was wondering, like if people are kind of comfortable in their ways, like a lot of people have been, like me, have been using SAS a long time, why move to Git? Well, like why change our workflow that we know and love and go to Git? What's the killer sort of reasons for doing that?
Yeah, so you certainly don't have to. I think that the reasons to use Git instead of some of the sort of more homebrew, I've definitely talked to people who have sort of homebrew options for dealing with a lot of things that Git makes easy, that they're very comfortable with. So this is things like developing your code in one environment and then deploying it in another environment, right? Git is really helpful for that. Like I said, you can just push your code up to the server and then pull it in the other environment. You can have files that aren't versions that define the environment and things like that. A lot of people will do is they'll have a prod version and a test version, and they'll just like copy and paste and things like that. And Git avoids having to do that, and particularly avoids making the mistakes, right? So like if you're you have a test version and a prod version, you're just moving the files over. Git will point out if there's a difference, right? So like, let's say you made an emergency change in prod, right, to deal with an emergency, and then you went back and tested and did some other things, and then we're going to copy the test files over prod. You might forget that you made the emergency change in prod and overwrite that change. A new version of the file that doesn't have the emergency change in it. Whereas Git will tell you, it'll say, no, wait, these files are, this is not the same file that the server thinks we have. There's a difference, and it'll show you the individual differences. I really like the ability to do diffs in Git. It's built in. It's not, you don't have to use anything outside of Git really to see that, inside Studio, when you say commit, like I showed in the PowerPoint, you have on the bottom, it says, here's the new changes, here's the green things that are new adds, here's the red things you deleted, etc. It gives you that ability to see exactly what changed and exactly what sort of changes you're making, so you can make sure you don't do anything unintentional. Obviously it backs your code up for you, which is nice. Of course, hopefully we all have backups of everything at our companies. And the last thing that I really like about it is it really makes it easier for multiple users to all work in the same area. I worked with someone on one of our big projects over the last couple of years. And he'd be working in one area. He worked on one area, and I worked on another area in the same code base. And every once in a while, we'd need to edit the same file, and we didn't have to worry about talking to each other and saying, "Hey, I'm going to edit this. Is that okay?" Because Git would do that for us. I would make a change. I would send it to push it up to the server, and then I'd send a merge request to him, and he would look at it and say, "Oh, you made this change, but in my version of the code, I haven't sent it to the server yet. I made a different change." And then he could figure it out, or the other way around. We didn't have to worry about accidentally changing something that would cause a problem for someone else. Git pretty much handles that all internally, which I really like.
Okay, that's really good. That's really helpful. I think we're just about out of time, so we might end it at that point. So I just want to say, on behalf of the 326 still watching at this point, thanks very much, Joe, for being with us today to answer questions about your presentation, Git and SAS, a match made in SAS Studio. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thanks for being here to help out. And thanks, Nancy, and everybody back at SAS headquarters. And thanks for everyone watching. I hope you all have a good rest of the day at SAS Global Forum.
Oh, yeah, and one